While I'm messing around, do you want to kind of introduce yourself as you're the resident social democrat?
I was just checking. Filthy Social Democrat doesn't fit in my Twitter bio, unfortunately. Um, yeah, I'm Keegs. My Twitter handle's at little Keegs0. I'm around. Um, God, what would I say about myself? I'm a program. My main job is I'm a programmer, but I just kind of do economics for fun in my free time. Um, and yeah, very much Social Democrat. Have been for a while now. And yeah, I kind of got started actually on. You mentioned James Medlock before. Him and
Oh
I
yeah.
have been close mutuals for like years now.
Hmm.
So uh,
Can you
yeah, he
cajole him into speaking to me? Is he just too shy to speak to
no
anyone?
he is very strict about his internet anonymity. So
Oh, that's it,
he'll
right?
give like written interviews, but no, he doesn't do voice. We've suggested before that like oh you could use something to like cover up your voice and stuff, but nah, he's very
You know,
private
when I
person.
first made my channel, I thought about doing that. I thought
Mm.
about covering up my voice with a voice changer, and then Hobby, my producer, was just like, "This sounds shit. Um, you can't make a chat because it's just like it just sounds like somebody who's like trying to, you know, uh, who's kidnapped somebody's kids and wants some money from them or something. Like it just sounds really
Yeah,
bad.
it sounds creepy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, super
I was,
creepy, super
I'm looking at my
creepy.
camera view and realizing there's a Jordan Peterson clean your room joke in here somewhere.
How dare you? How
Uh,
dare you propose that we try to fix society? Yeah. How dare you?
yeah, never mind.
Mate,
I
you
gotta get off. I gotta clean my
gotta
room, I
clean your
guess.
room, bucko.
Oh,
Um,
oh.
uh, so, so yeah. Thanks for coming on. I've managed to sort out the stream so people can actually see you now. So yeah, I mean, you're kind of a long term mutual of mine as well, right? And a patron, I believe. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for your support. But I've been interested in you because you don't you sort of post quite a lot of interesting stuff, I think, on Medium, but you don't. I feel like maybe you don't get as much attention as you deserve, or you don't necessarily seek attention. You just sort of you write interesting posts about very specific things, and you're not sort of trying to go viral or anything. So I just thought it'd be nice to share some of your ideas with everyone. So if you could talk us through, I mean, this is a big question. Obviously, we can take it piece by piece, but if you could talk us through like
Talk about
why you're
everything
a
I think.
social democrat, um, and yeah, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I guess it's interesting. I heard you mention before that you'll describe yourself as a democratic socialist first, and I don't want to be. I'm from the U.S. by the way. Relevant point.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, obviously, in the U.S. when people hear democratic socialist, they think of like Bernie Sanders.
Right.
Um, and there's this weird way, which I love Bernie, but there's a weird way in which like a social democrat online is to the left of like Bernie Sanders, generally speaking.
Right.
Uh, and so like there's a weird inversion there. And yeah, really when I describe myself as a social democrat, it's because like you mentioned before about pointing to the Scandinavian countries. It's really two things. It's one being like, yes, I'm explicitly supportive of, free stuff, a lot of the stuff you're talking
Hmm.
about. I'm explicitly supportive of big government and big spending. Um, and it's also as a way to like, I always say, I'm a socialist first, but social democrat second. My tendency of socialism is social democracy. Um, and I think it just comes back to being online in very very lefty circles for a while, and kind of you were talking about this with anarchism a bit, about how a lot of I don't know what the right word would be, but um, kind of unserious analysis by anarchists, for example. Though a lot of like Marxists and stuff do this too. Um, and yeah, I was very kind of like being younger in my college days online. I was very dissatisfied with a lot of the online discourse about that. Um, until I discovered, people like James Medlock or Matt Bruenig, um, and kind of introducing me to the lost socialist history of social democracy, about its origins and all that.
Hmm.
And it doesn't make sense, and this is a whole nother thing we could get into, but uh, like the way Nordic countries have ended up makes sense if you conceptualize social democracy as an initially socialist project. Like the way they pursued how their unions are set up and how their welfare is set up and everything like that. If you're a socialist trying to work in kind of a modern industrialized society, it makes sense you would go about it that way. And yeah, I think that's like social democracy is the only kind of form of socialism that has had significant success in developed countries, really. Um, yeah, which is not, plenty of places have done Marxist revolutions and it's pretty good, and there's anarchist places that do fine, but not in the developed West, which is where I live. So yeah, that's kind of just that simple fact that, like, social democrats, a bunch of them are calling themselves socialists and made a bunch of big gains in the West, and no one else has done that well. And yeah, I think that's initially what got me into it, and still, what keeps me calling myself a social democrat.
I mean, basically, you're aligning yourself with what you see as a political coalition that has done quite a lot for the people and for workers.
Yeah,
And
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. Sorry, carry on.
oh no, I was saying is, yeah, it's a matter of like, okay, practically, the Social Democrats have accomplished a lot.
Hmm.
And how did they do that? What was their strategy like? How might it be, similar or different today? And there's a matter of you didn't dig into this too much in your video, I don't think, but there's a matter of like, if you kind of just have a half decent approach to talking about welfare, healthcare can be more complicated,
Hmm.
but there's just like there's certain obvious bad and good ways to structure welfare. And one thing you didn't mention in the video, which is actually worth mentioning when you're talking about UBI, is the way that a lot of UBI pilots, maybe you mentioned it in passing, actually, I'm not sure, but they have really strict cutoffs, like income or asset cutoffs.
Hmm.
And a lot of times when it's like, there might be a study that says, oh, we gave people UBI and like some of them stopped working, right? But then you look at the actual data, and it's because if you make over whatever amount, they just cut out the entire benefit. So of course people worked less. You're imposing basically a massive tax rate on them. Um, and yeah, so there's obviously like dumb ways to structure welfare like that. And the Social Democrats basically figured out how to do welfare correctly. And it's been worn away since neoliberalism has come in. Um, but yeah, they basically figured out how to do it correctly. And in the U.S., at least, we are nowhere close to that. So I think that's
Yeah.
a important perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I quoted like Thomas Sowell making this kind of point, but is where the right are correct, half
Mm.
correct, right? Where they're like, okay, so you've got a welfare state, you've got a safety net, and then as soon as you start working, it gets withdrawn, and so your net gain in income is like very low, or in some cases historically has even been zero. And it's like,
Yep.
well, okay, that is a welfare trap, right? That's not a good welfare state. And then a UBI. I mean, I added like an edit, I remember in the video, because I realized I didn't make this point clearly enough, but like a UBI, anything you earn is on top of it, right? So
Right.
therefore, like, there is still an incentive to work. You're not having these ridiculous cutoffs, which I think is like means testing and cutoffs are like the most, they're the worst things that a welfare state or public services can have.
Yeah, and even worse, which I don't know if you guys have any of this in the UK, but Medicaid, for example, in the US has asset tests, which are even worse. Because the worst example of this, just a little bit peek into the insanity of the US. Um, Medicare, our health insurance program for older folks, doesn't really cover long-term care, but
Hmm.
Medicaid does. Medicaid being the kind of, more means-tested one. So what old people have to do is basically purposely impoverish themselves so that they qualify for Medicaid and then can have long-term support. Absolutely insane and infuriating way to run a welfare system.
I actually didn't know that. That is maddening. Yeah, that I can't believe that. So what, they impoverish themselves? So is that just like working less, or like
Well, you get to an old enough age, a lot of it is like they'll have to like sell their house, for example, because it's an asset that's worth a lot. Try to,
okay.
try to like maybe give away some of their money to their kids, things like that. Um,
So
and to get,
choosing between your house and your healthcare.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
just very infuriating.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it's completely ridiculous. I mean, I think it's interesting with means testing because if you're talking about persuading people, I find that I would say the average person that I interact with online, which is a very small sample of my country, let alone the world and your country,
Well, yeah, yeah,
but I think they kind of are anti means testing. But I would say your average person is absolutely pro means testing, because what they'll say is they'll be like, "Oh well, what? So you want the rich to benefit, right?"
mm,
They'll be like, "Oh well, so you got a UB. Oh, what, so you're sending like $2,000 to the rich every month as well, right?" It's a really powerful argument, and I kind of struggle, rhetorically to address it.
yeah.
I mean,
It's
what's your
That's
experience?
counterintuitive, right? It's like, well, yeah, it would. We are sending money to rich people, and you can be like, no, 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 but like distributively, and then you look at it at night and stuff like that. But just, yeah, it's very intuitive that like, why are you doing that? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, somebody in my chat saying one thing that I've done as well, which is like you said, okay, the progressive tax is the means test, right?
Right,
That's the point. And
right.
it's the one, that's why so we do need means testing, because we need progressivity. And means testing is an attempt to enact progressivity, but it is one that doesn't work if you do it on a program by program basis.
Yeah,
So you've got to do it across the whole economy with taxes.
right.
Right.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, yeah, and this was always a powerful argument that it's one of those things now, like a lot of, if you see people arguing about welfare online, like a lot of these arguments I've had hundreds of times at this point. I could do it in my sleep. But this is one of them, is the fact that like if you think about it like let's say food stamps, for example. I forget the exact phase out rate, but of food stamps in the U.S.
Hmm.
But let's say the phase out rate is like 40% or something like that. I think it's something like that. So every dollar more you make in income, you get 40 cents less in food stamps. And it's like, well, okay, that's a 40% tax. That's the sentence I just said of you get a dollar more and 40 cents gets taken away. It's literally a 40% tax.
Yeah.
Those are the same thing. And yeah, it's like one of those things that if I could inject like an idea into the American populace, that would be like one of the things, is like these are the same thing.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, you're right. It's very natural. It doesn't feel right to be sending money to rich people. But yeah, you just have to, people have to be careful to think about it a little more than that.
Hmm.
And yeah, this is some of what actually really informative experience for me was my high school ex-girlfriend was pretty poor, and just kind of watching her and her family try to navigate the system was very like I realized they had a very politically informative experience for me. And that's when you realize, all this means testing stuff, you might even say, oh, well, it looks clean on paper doing this, right? But you get into the weeds, and, you got people in poverty, who are whatever, already working, taking care of kids, now having to go through reams of paperwork to get the
Hmm.
proper benefits. And it's like, what are we doing here? Why are we putting that on them? And
Yeah. And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
always the case that if there's a means test, there will be some people who are eligible and need it who don't get it because
yeah.
they don't, jump through those hoops.
Right. Or, they fill out a form wrong, they put in the wrong number
Mm.
somewhere. It could be anything.
I mean,
Um,
one thing, yeah, you could almost frame it as like get government out of my welfare, couldn't you? Like
yeah, that's the
over-regulated public services and welfare.
it's a very funny argument I like making sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is something that has changed and is kind of, maybe contrary to your views, has made me kind of less anarchist leaning over time, because I was initially very kind of, well, left wing, but left libertarian, like when I first got active on Twitter and stuff. Is I think there's a significant extent to which, and this might be personal bias because this is how I feel, where it's like you just don't want to deal with the hassle of stuff, right?
Mm.
So you don't feel, and I think that's a very powerful thing. It's like, why do people hate inflation? They don't want to deal with the hassle of like figuring out the relative prices of everything again. And like you said, that's a good argument in terms of mean testing too. You don't want to deal with the hassle. People hate paying taxes in the U.S. because it's such a hassle here. And uh, uh, yeah, I think that's a very probably in the U.S. especially that's a very powerful thing of like just not having to deal with it. Same thing for it's a good argument for like universal healthcare too, of just being like go wherever you want, it's going to be paid for, you're going to be covered, just go get your healthcare. That's
Mm.
just like a
Mm.
huge thing that people don't have to deal with anymore if you take that off of people's backs. And yeah, you don't being in the UK, you don't have this struggle of the going to your doctor for 10 years and then suddenly they're not on your insurance anymore and you just have to switch, and it's stuff like that. It's just such a big,
It's unimaginable to me that it's so
yeah.
interesting, as many flaws as our healthcare system has, and increasingly, I mean, I have to sign up to a doctor when I move house, right? That's in my local area,
Right.
which entails filling out a form, but like that's it. Right,
Yeah.
and I
Nice.
always can. Yeah. It's like, yeah, that was that. I mean, it sounded like when you were talking about taxes as well, it reminded me of that. There's an NPR podcast, I think, called Tax Hero, and it's about that guy, and I forget his name, but he basically was trying to streamline the tax system in the USA and make it, because it's one of the most invasive tax systems in the rich world.
Yeah.
It's such a pain in the ass. No wonder people in the States hate taxes, and like in Sweden it's so easy. And he was trying to push towards something more like the Swedish system. But then actually who pushed back? Well, it was right wingers, because they were like, no, we need people to hate government, right? We need people
Right.
to hate
Yeah.
taxes. We want it to be a pain in the ass. We don't want people's interactions with the government to be easy, right? So it's just really interesting, like, yeah, how horrible intrusive government and kind of less of a welfare state seem to go hand in hand, contrary to what like a kind of libertarian might think.
Yeah, and that's this is in the U.S. it always bears pointing out too, because we always have to people generally also file their taxes through basically like a phrase, but private companies that prepare your taxes for you, because they're also complicated and it's hard to do by yourself.
Hmm.
And yeah, they have basically lobbied the government to prevent that from being changed. Obviously, the government totally could just handle filling out your taxes for you, and then just double check with you. That's what you mentioned Sweden, and yeah, I think in Sweden they literally just text you and they're like, "Hey, these are your taxes. Does this look good?" And then if you say yes, your taxes are done. And
That's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah, God, I wish. And but yeah, in the U.S., there's been these lobbying by private companies like Intuit to prevent that from happening. But yeah, to your point about right wingers wanting to make interaction with the government, kind of suck basically. Yeah, all of the smart right wingers, if you talk to, know that very well. That's why you hear the same thing of like talking about VATs, right? Talking about value added taxes.
Hmm.
Same thing. All the smart right wingers are like, no, if you do this, people aren't going to notice, like, and you can tax them a lot, and that would be bad. So we need to stop you from doing that.
Hmm.
It's like very much an explicit goal of them, to make things any contact with the government have a lot of friction, and not be easy to actually get anything done. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. It's a completely, I mean, preaching to the converted, right? But it is a completely wrong-headed view of freedom to think like, there's a dial called government, and when you turn it up,
Right.
you've got less freedom, and when you turn it down, you've got more freedom. It's like, no, it's it's the opposite of freedom to not only not have guaranteed healthcare, but to have horrible interactions with the state when you want that healthcare. Like that's much more invasive
Right. Yeah. Of course.
than a universal system that's free at the point of use.
Yeah, yeah, of course, and it's the one that always drives you crazy, which I'm sure no one in the chat is silly enough to think these things, but the way they're like, I'm like, okay, like sometimes, I'm arguing with the right wingers on Twitter. I'm like, okay, you understand if you get welfare and you get money, you are more free now, right? This is like
Mm.
a very basic. You are literally more free to do what you want and buy what you want. But yeah, apparently, I don't know. I guess Americans don't get that.
It's literally like, okay, so you like, say you walk down the street, right, and you don't have money, the amount of things you can do is greatly reduced compared to somebody with money. And not only is the amount of things you can do reduced, that's enforced by the state. If you go into a shop and you try to take something without money, then okay, I mean, for all intents and purposes, the shopkeeper's probably just going to chase you himself. But ultimately, there might be a security guard, and if you keep doing it, or if you somehow get caught, the police might be involved, right? It's like that is state-backed coercion, right? And the same goes for everything you buy with money. So it's like, okay, you're increasing the number of restrictions on people's lives by having them by making them or keeping them poor.
Yeah, and this is like, yeah, why I like to. I also, I think, I guess people kind of want to try to divide things into being like, oh, this bad stuff I don't like is coercive, and then the other stuff is all completely non-coercive.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's not really how it works. And that's what I try to, because I'm a very, big pro-state, pro-government guy. I try to be honest about it and being like, well, no, like this whole thing we're doing here, there's coercion all around, right? It's a question of, how do we minimize coercion on people? Right now especially in the United States, we coerce poor people a whole lot because we don't, give them a whole lot in benefits and, like you said, make them fill out all these invasive forms and stuff like that. And it's like, it's a coercion we can take away, but there's always going to be more coercion in other places. Taxing rich people more is a coercion, but that's fine. It's still a good thing to do,
Yeah. Yeah, of course. There's
yeah.
there's no uncoercive society really. I don't think. And like, I mean, this is God. Okay, are we going to talk about thought slime again? Okay, so and with anarchism, sometimes I get this like, you get this notion that like there's going to be like absolutely no coercion as well, like left anarchism, and I'm like, okay, so if I can think, you're saying there's no state now, anarchists. The anarchists are going to get mad. They end up reinventing states. But let's say they don't do that, right? Let's say have you ever read Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, it's my favorite book. Yeah. But that's about an anarchist society, and everything seemingly is enforced through social norms. And it's like, okay, it's not the power of the state. It does raise different questions, but social norms, social like coercion, like that's a really powerful force. If you're excommunicating people, and I think in her book actually, people who don't work, they do actually get beaten up eventually. And like, so it's like people around will like, they'll tell you off, they'll shun you, they'll exclude you, you won't get any food, you might get beaten up. And it's like, I don't think you can avoid this fundamentally. I don't want to start talking about human nature, but I wish existence weren't like this. But I think we have to have some mechanism for punishing people who don't cooperate socially, right? And if you don't have a state, I think you've got these kind of social norms, and they may even be directly coercive, via violence. But I just think there's no escaping it. It's governance, right?
Yeah, I think governance is the right word. I think about this a lot too with to get back to complaining about economics, economists like to act as if markets don't have government, but they do. It's just not, the traditional public forms you think of. They have governance. They have a way of organizing and dealing with affairs. It's not just these, an infinite amount of firms freely competing or anything like that. When you deal with the real world, and that's the same thing, we're kind of talking about here. In the real world, you need a way of addressing problems and a way of, rewarding or punishing people if they do right or wrong. And yeah, the same thing applies to, any kind of anarchist society you want to make, even if it's not, whatever definition of the state an anarchist is going with. Even if it doesn't fit that definition, you're still going to need governance, a way of organizing things, and, making sure stuff gets done that needs to get done. And yeah, that's going to involve some kind of, coercion. People sometimes try to draw a distinction between, incentives and coercion. I'm not sure the distinction is all, I'm not sure that's a real distinction, actually. We just call things incentives that are only a little coercive.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and yeah, people don't like thinking of it that way, but
Well, if you're giving somebody an incentive, you're withholding something from them unless they do what you want, right? So it's
right.
like if I
So it's
want you
like,
to
yeah,
work
that's
on my
the same thing.
farm, yeah.
Yeah.
So like
Uh,
I have to have a way of denying you that incentive if you
right.
don't fulfill the criteria.
Right. And yeah, so that's what coercion is at the end of the day. And yeah, same thing of people try to make some clean divide between those things, but it's not so clean. But yeah, same thing of yeah, I've had many frustrating arguments with people online who think there doesn't need to be any kind of incentives or coercion or anything like that. It's also frustrating because having I don't even say not even being particularly well read. It's like there are clever ways you could imagine a more anarchist society being organized, and like instead you just go with like oh yeah, we're gonna make what we need, it's gonna be fine. And it's like no, people have done work about this. Like there have been anarchists
Yeah,
that actually organize production and stuff. Like you can
yeah.
talk about
I mean,
that.
I'm a fan. I'm a big fan of Ostrom, and her escalating social punishments. I mean, some people are saying like you shouldn't Ursula Le Guin's society. I mean, it was fictitious, obviously, with people, getting knocked about if they didn't work. That is coercive, but that's not what they want. But I think okay, that's fine, but like these social punishments, right? They can be really like there are some right. I would rather be punched in the face, right, than be excluded from my group of friends permanently.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
I can tell you that for sure. I would much rather somebody just gave me a slap and said stop doing what you're doing, right? Rather than shunning me completely, right? So like to be like physical coercion is this like always this like definitely worse thing than social coercion is completely untrue, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's just one of those things that in practical in our day-to-day lives, it's just that the physical coercion is generally that we see is generally worse than the social kind. um
Yeah.
the social kind is someone just telling you an idiot and telling you to shut up, and the physical
Yeah.
kind is like police brutality, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
yeah. Obviously, yeah, we can. Yeah, one of those is worse than the other. Um,
yeah, in practice. And oh yeah, I saw someone mention that someone saying in the chat, yeah, that anarchism is no state, but it doesn't mean no governance. I
sure.
said that, and then some anarchist got mad at me on Twitter. So I don't know. I always try to.
I love it.
So many years of being on Twitter has made me like so careful about the stuff that I say, because I
Oh,
always think about,
I
like the
can't.
one guy I think of that like didn't think of that idea that
Yeah,
way.
yeah, literally, yeah. It's bad. It's like because I think I've kind of lent away from that a bit recently, and I'm like, you know what? Like, fuck it. Like, if somebody just like doesn't like the way I put this, then like they're
Yeah.
they can go off. Um,
But yeah, and I think the one little thing I want to touch
yeah,
on that point, because I think there's some quotes from, for example, Enrico Malatesta was I want to say Italian anarchist, um, and he has quotes about being like that, or like in the quote he's saying stuff that's like, no, it's government that is bad, not the state. But this is something I think about with Marx too, is like you can't ever put too much emphasis on specific wordings like that, especially when it's a translation. Like trying to read into it that
mm,
much with our modern understanding of what the state and government is, like you can't specific wording like that. You can't put too much on. And this is something, back to the point about social democracy is. I'll get into arguments with Marxists online talking about, well, you mentioned before about how, they're kind of, let's say, underdeveloped view of the state. And you have to understand in is a relevant context, in like in Marxist time, yes, the government was a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Like,
mm,
universal suffrage, this is what I was thinking about in the U.S. In the U.S., we did not actually have universal suffrage until the Civil Rights Acts were passed in like the 1960s. And it's still, stuff like felons can't vote and stuff like that. But the only time we even got close was in the 60s. That was so recently. appealing to the views of government that people had 100 years ago just isn't really appropriate. Um, yeah, there's a funny way in which a lot of older socialists you read will be, going off about whatever horrible stuff the government was doing at the time as horribly undemocratic. But then they fought for and got universal suffrage, and that undermines their initial analysis, right? If you're living in a society now where people can actually, democratically control and elect people and stuff like that, although I mean, in the U.S. we have the Senate and the Electoral College and all of that. It's a whole other thing. But still, if you have that kind of democratic power, your analysis has to be different. And that's what, if you look at kind of the social democratic theorists who were writing around the time of like post World War II, when people start getting universal suffrage and stuff like that. That's what they were talking about, was like, okay, well, we got like democracy stuff kind of established now. How do we go about now developing? They always talk about you do political democracy and social democracy, then economic democracy, and yeah, how do you go about actually building that now that the government is the state can be a force for democratic good, and yeah, you just need a different analysis for that.
Yeah, I mean, that is the social. This is what you were talking about at the beginning, right? This is the social democrat ethos that I think did help to build so much of the welfare state, and that was a part of like workers' movements and unions, and were highly integrated with it, and also of attempts to build democratic socialism as well over the medium or long term.
Yeah, and if you look at, it's always an interesting point too. I can somewhere I'll dig up the quote from this. If you look at Sweden, for example, there's a funny thing where if you're some more like contemporary accounts of Sweden in like the height of social democratic power in like the 70s and 80s, a lot of times they'll refer to it as a kind of like more free marketplace, because the reason they say that is because a lot of times in economic policy the unions led, the government didn't. So there's a funny quote a while back of like in that time period, I forget some new labor regulation the government was probably trying to pass, and the unions were basically like, no, we're doing that. You shouldn't like step on our turf like this, and yeah, so like it's actual social democratic history. A lot of times it's like social democracy was not some kind of imposed upon thing by a class of intellectuals. A lot of times in Sweden is the top example of this. It's like the ideology that the labor movement developed to get more power. They were very much leading in a lot of those developments.
Right, it was a means to an end as well. Well, it was an end in itself as well, but it was also a means to an end, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's why it's you have to talk about social democracy as it was an evolution over a long time period. I always jokingly say how Lenin used to be a member of a social democratic party, and yeah, social democracy from then to like the height of Sweden's social democratic power to what it is now is like it has changed a lot over history, and yeah, you can't have a good conception of it unless you think of that whole timeline.
I mean, it's interesting because I feel like sometimes it kind of frustrates me because let's talk about some of the anti-social democracy arguments, right? There's two main ones, one of which frustrates me, the other which I'm ambivalent on. So let's talk about the one that frustrates me first. It's to say that social democrats are just kind of like historically have allied with fascists, and I mean they use Germany. It's a very German-centric argument, I think. It's basically, this is what happened in Germany in the 1930s, therefore this defines social democrats, right? But I mean, I don't know what you think of that argument.
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I try not to laugh when you say it. I think it's like so overplayed. I think the main funny thing to note is I've been called a social fascist a time or two on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing about that term, it comes from kind of that period in Germany is yeah, that like, because the whole thing in Germany at the time, right, which don't get me wrong, social democrats there screwed up plenty too, but there was the whole like social democrats and communists very much were fighting each other instead of taking fascism as a serious threat, and Yeah, to the anarchist benefit, by the way, that generally has not been a problem with anarchists. They very much hate fascists and take fascism very seriously.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, like the term social fascist was like a thing that was around in like the kind of Soviet ideology for a while, and then like after a pretty short time period, Stalin was like, "No, that's stupid. We're not doing that anymore. That doesn't make any sense."
Hmm.
It was like only a period of a few years that was like a serious term that was considered. And yeah, I think it's a funny example too because you have the completely butchering the pronunciation, the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact
Hmm.
during World War II, and it's like, I mean, we can point fingers all day, but like
Yeah.
let's just agree that we didn't take the fascists seriously enough, and like not don't do that again.
Yeah. Yeah, fascism. Yeah, exactly. Fascism wasn't taken seriously enough. It was a very horrible, tumultuous time with a lot of upheaval in a lot of countries, as well. From the World War One and post World War One, the Depression, the revolutions, right? Like, and it was a really horrible period. I think pointing to
Yeah,
that,
and this is also
generalizing
talking.
from that period is wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Talking about kind of like the about democracy historically too. One of the big splits of like when social democracy started becoming its own thing, like when it kind of separated from communism, is excuse me, that a lot of social democrats were pro staying in World War One in Germany, for example. We got that wrong. Sorry about that, folks. That was our bad. Um, and that was kind of one of the big splits in the U.S. too. It's interesting. I think this kind of discourse is spread out elsewhere too, talking about social democrats versus democratic socialists. It's the same thing in German. The origin of both of those
Mm.
phrases is like really the same German word. There's been the distinction developed. Some of what I mentioned World War One in the U.S. specifically. I was reading about, and I might not get the history exactly right, but some of it was like the group there was there was a leftist group, and then the group that like didn't want to pull out of Vietnam was the social democratic group, and then the other ones called themselves democratic socialists. But then like
Yeah. Well,
because of that nomenclature, it kind of just became like, oh well, social democracy
yeah.
must mean
I mean,
just because.
I mean, this is like, it's weird, like the, a kind of Marxist would make that argument because, unless you are a Stalinist, surely you would make some version of the, well, that was called communism, but it wasn't actually communism argument.
Yeah,
So, why
yeah,
you're getting into distinctions like democratic socialist versus social democrat, right? Like in German, which you don't speak, right? Then like, this is these are linguistic games
right,
and
yeah,
nothing more.
yeah. What are we actually doing here?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And it's like you're kind of cutting yourself off from allies. I mean, I don't want to reflect too much on the Twitter left politically, but it's like do you want to have any allies? Do you want to have any like clearly social democrats aren't fascists. You know what I mean? Like clearly
yeah, there's
modern
actual
social
fascists.
democrats aren't. Yeah, there
Quite a
are
lot.
actual fascists. Why don't we ally, even if only temporarily, to defeat them?
Yeah, there is. This is a kind of. It's something I've seen a lot online. It's not. This is not just a left thing. I think a lot of
Mm, mm,
different people do. Different ideological groups do this for different
mm.
reasons. There's a frustrating thing in which somebody sees like an ideological group they don't ally with do something, and they're pressed to say that the thing is bad for no reason, or that like the thing isn't actually good. I saw there was. It might even been in your like Twitter replies or something like that. Something about how some statement about like, oh, like, well, reformism has never worked and never done anything good, and it's like that's obviously wrong. Like, this is wrong.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to twist yourself. You could just say, well, yeah, if you want to take this approach, you can just say, yeah, reformism has done some good, but I don't think it's the right approach. Blah blah blah. Like, you don't have to pretend, everything that people you don't ally with do is bad. And yeah, that's what I try to be conscious a lot on Twitter because it's easy to slip into like I think this guy is an idiot. I want to disagree with everything he's saying.
Yeah.
And but yeah, that easily devolves into saying very silly things online. So I try to resist the temptation.
Yeah, yeah. There's a weird accelerationism working and lurking in there, isn't there, as well? Like, if you're like nothing good has ever happened, it's like, oh, what about the welfare state? And you're like, oh, well, that just bought off the proletariat, and it just delayed the end of capitalism or something. I don't know. It's just like is not very sensible. Should we talk about imperialism as well? So now this.
You mentioned you had a second objection to social democracy. You hear that you
Yeah,
were more
that's
iffy
what I
on.
mean. The imperialism one.
Oh, that's
The
the
one that
imperialism
it
part?
relies on imperialism. So I
Yeah.
don't. Yeah, I go back and forth on this. I think it really depends on what the person means specifically when they're saying it.
Sure.
Because in one sense, it's kind of obviously true as a description of the world, right? You have unequal labor relations, trade relations, blah blah blah, labor rights across the world. That's true, right? And surely the social democratic countries, like every other country in the West, benefit from that in terms of lower price consumer goods. But then there's this argument that it kind of has to depend on imperialism, that you can only have social democracy with imperialism. So I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I think yeah, you're right that there's a kind of, there's a, it depends on what they mean by it exactly. I think it's one of those things that like the phrase, it's just social democracy depends on imperialism. It's just one of those phrases that has just become stuck in the lexicon of the online left, even though like people say it and don't really know what it means or don't have like a fully fleshed argument there. I think the important thing to one way to start thinking about this is like I'm taking Sweden as the classic example, also because I've studied it more. But like Sweden had a bigger, more developed welfare state in like the 70s and 80s, and they were whatever like half as rich then. Yeah, and like the Social Democrats started passing big welfare programs in like the 50s, the 1950s.
Right.
And it's like, well, they could do it when they were so much poorer then, but like, suddenly if the price of consumer goods went up now, like the whole system would blow up. Like, you have to think through how is that actually supposed to work? Like, the worst case scenario here is like, oh, like the price of some stuff goes up, we got to pay out some more, welfare to keep people's standard of living consistent or whatever. And it's like, okay, we can do that. That's fine.
Hmm.
People act like it's some catastrophic thing instead of something of like, oh yeah, if people weren't being exploited like this, then this would just be a bit more expensive. The similar way to think of it too is like it's like okay, kind of we can think of this as the core social democratic model is basically like we institute big taxes on everyone and then have universal welfare programs, right? That's basically what's going on there. Like what does imperialism actually get in the way of doing that there? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, there are, developing countries have, can have problems with like trade relations and stuff like that, and their, the value of the currency that can make that stuff tough. But like fundamentally, if we just got rid of imperialism, could we not have tax funded Social Security? Of course we could.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we can't do that. And yeah, it's really just people tend to act like that's some catastrophic death row to social democracy instead of like yeah, some stuff probably should be more expensive because we should pay people better.
There's a
Yeah, it's not
weirdly
so.
conservative argument in a way as well. I think
Yeah,
because it's
yeah,
kind of like
very.
we can't have nice things. I can actually imagine a conservative saying it. Right? They're like, in fact, I'm sure they're like, well, your standard of living just depends on this. You say you want the third world to be like liberated, but you don't actually because you got your car and you've got your house. You know what I mean? Like you can imagine a conservative making a very similar argument. It's like, well, wait a minute. Like we can just like redistribute
Yeah, and
income
that's
and
what.
yeah.
Yeah, complaining about economics again. That is a thing that like drew me to a lot of heterodox economics is the idea that like no, actually, not everything is zero sum like that.
Hmm.
Because it is, that's a kind of conservative approach. It lends yourself, some things are zero sum, sure, but thinking the world generally works like that very
Sure.
easily lends you to a kind of conservative approach because it's like a thing of like, oh well, if we exploit people less and it just gets worse for everyone else, then like, what's the point? Um, and also not a very inspiring political message to just be like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we should make sure that people are exploited. It's gonna make your life worse. Like not, it's not actually a functioning. That's not something that's gonna rally people to your cause exactly. Um, And yeah, that's the other point too of like, okay, if people in the third world were less exploited, and that would be good and everything. One of the effects of that though would be they would buy more stuff from other countries, and then people, in the first, is the funny thing I think about, if people in the third world made more, people in the first world, like, they more of their stuff would be being bought, and then they would have more money. It's
Mm.
not a zero. It's not a zero sum thing. The prices of some stuff will go up, and then there will be more of some production as well. I don't know how that nets out exactly, and
Yeah,
you can.
yeah. Do you want to say like we'd have more expensive and fewer like Fisher Price toys?
Right,
Less fast fat. You wouldn't buy a fucking new piece of clothing from ASOS every day. Maybe,
right.
but you can still have a doctor that you go to. Right? There's
Yeah,
literally nothing stopping that doctor from being trained. And like I don't really get it. I
yeah,
guess.
and this is yeah, and that's another point too. Talking about the third world, and this was very much this part of the social democratic approach too. Is talking about kind of increasing wages as being a pro investment strategy, right? Basically, if you can pay people shit, you don't have to invest to try to do any automation or make anything productive or anything like that. You just
Hmm.
keep paying them shit, it doesn't matter. Um, and and yeah, so it's actually like, no, well, if we raise, I think this is true, within first world countries, it's true within third world countries. If you force people to pay their workers more, they're going to be like, oh shit, and start investing in actually, making stuff more efficient and more productive, investing in machinery and stuff like that. And so yeah, it's also not an immediate thing from, oh, wages get higher and then the price of goods at the end is higher. It's going to be true from some stuff, but that's not always true. Um, uh, yeah, it's the
Yeah.
same thing. Not to get the whole
No,
inflation in the
yeah, yeah,
U.S.
no. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting argument though, isn't it? It's like, yeah, you create capital intensive investment and technological advancement, and you increase productivity. Because I remember Paul Mason making this argument once. It might have just been at a conference, but it was like from his trips to Chinese factories. It was very
Mhm.
clear that they weren't investing in technology that would make things more productive, precisely because labor costs are so low. So it's like, again, there's free lunches everywhere. Increase wages, increase social spending, increase capital investment and productivity, right? Like that those things can go together, and this is it's a very post Keynesian argument, right?
Yeah. Like I said, yeah. Back to the heterodox point. Yeah, that's one of those things that you know that is a point heterodox economists make a lot. And yeah, I think it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so one thing I wanted to speak to you about, which we haven't, I mean, we've talked about taxes, but I in my video I realised that this was going to be a step too far, even for the amount of stuff that I put in my videos. But yeah, like how to sort of pay for it.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering, I don't think, in fact, I know that providing both UBI and UBS, for instance, but that's Universal Basic Income and Universal Basic Services for anyone who didn't know. It's manageable. It could be like 10% of GDP in some countries. It could even be like 15%. It's not like above 100% of GDP, which I think
Right.
you might glean from looking at conservatives who are not really thinking about it and are doing all the accounting wrong. So it is achievable, but I was just wondering, what's your preference for like the types of taxes and how you might achieve that?
Yeah. It's started going up. There's a whole thing here. One of the things too in your, I think, so you make it's hard sometimes talking about when I was listening to your video. Um, I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way you made your video was to kind of like address a certain type of person making a certain type of argument, right? It wasn't like you were talking to like liberals who are kind of pro welfare spending, right? A lot of it
No.
was like, these more kind of neoliberal, right wing libertarian
Yeah.
type arguments they make. That's what you were approaching.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I respect that. And sometimes, I experience this on Twitter a lot, where it's like, ooh, like I know this person. You might be arguing against a right wing guy, and you're like, I can't change this guy's entire worldview. I got to
Hmm.
focus on like the little things he's wrong about.
Hmm.
Uh, and yeah, so to that point and stuff, we do have to be careful about like not pretending that increasing the deficit is always bad, and that everything has to be one-to-one paid for.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's been more recently listening to reading a lot of folks like Nathan Tankis, who rules.
Yep.
And stuff like that. You were talking too about this is very much in the vein of like how like MMTers just kind of keep on getting proven right about like all of their macro stuff.
Yeah.
There's just several rounds of wins at this point, and it's like, what can you say? They were right. I don't know what to tell you. There's an article about, I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's an article from 2019 of I think Nathan Tankis and Rohan Gray, another MMTer, from 2019, and like there's this whole paragraph where they're like, oh, like inflation isn't always demand driven. You could have stuff like supply chain issues and stuff like that come up, and you need agencies and stuff to direct that. And then I remember reading that in 2019, and I was like, what is he talking about? And now I'm like, oh, that's what he's talking about.
Is that the FT Alphaville article?
Yeah, I think.
I need to reread that then, because I didn't know that they mentioned supply chains. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, all that to make a point of like, the core problem is not one-to-one corresponding taxes to spending or anything like that. People also get confused about this of like, like they pretend like, oh, like, if we do take $2 trillion from a wealth tax, then we can just like put that into whatever healthcare or something like that. And it's like, well, in terms of if you're looking at the real resources, you're not really deallocating that many real resources if you just lower people's wealth. Like that doesn't, you're not considering do anything with it. So it's not actually just going to like net out and have no effect. And yeah, so to that, that being said, taxes are still good and I love them very much. My general approach is, and I think some of this is like is variable to whatever you can get to work in your country. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But yeah, so my general approach is first of all to basically get rid of all tax expenditures. Your deductions and exemptions and stuff like that. Part of that is I think the U.S. has over like 150 different tax expenditures. And yeah, part of that is like it's just such a complex mess. And you end up giving a bunch of benefits to small groups, like or bigger groups like homeowners get the mortgage interest deduction in the U.S., which is a hugely regressive thing because of course richer people have more expensive homes.
Yep.
And
or have homes in the first place.
Or have homes in the first place. Yeah, of course. And yeah, so it's hugely regressive. So yeah, basically all that stuff get rid of. If you want to give people money, give them money. Don't try to do this whole thing through the tax system. And yeah, broadly the way I like to think of it, I think this makes sense as a political matter. I think actually FDR talked about this when he was talking about Social Security in the U.S. about because they were debating at the time whether to like go with like a payroll tax for it or to go with like a consumption tax or something like that. And FDR said he's like, yeah, I get that like a consumption tax, like he's like convinced economically it would be better, but he's like, but if we do a payroll tax, it's going to be money coming out of people's paychecks, and they're going to want to make sure they get Social Security because it's their money they put in, and therefore Social Security is going to be fine and very hard to undercut. And yeah, I find that pretty convincing. I think generally, something like unemployment insurance, like old age pensions, and health insurance too. It makes sense to do that through payroll taxes. Very much. This is a kind of there's a line in The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, by butchering his name, but Gasta Esping Anderson. Where he says, that's kind of the social democratic approach is, how, everyone pays in, everyone benefits, and everybody, feels obligated to pay and also feels obligated to, there's this feeling of attachment of like, I put in this money, now I deserve to get the money out. And it's a very simple thing, but I think that's very powerful when you're talking about whatever unemployment insurance benefits, disability too. And old age pensions. I
feel obliged to point to play Milton Friedman and point out the bit where he says in his welfare lecture 100%. He's like, the welfare state starts and you've got like 10% of the people paying and 90% of the people benefiting, and you end up with 100% of the people paying and 100% of the people benefiting. And I was like, yeah, right.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah, I made a couple little notes of things I want to mention. That was one of them. He said that, and I'm like, yeah, that's what we're going for here.
Yeah. Shifting consumption towards public services that are free at the point of use, and vital, that serve human needs and are fairly distributed. That sounds good.
I think that is, and like in the UK too, that's a thing of like it's our NHS. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even if lots of things are run badly in it, there's still that sense of kind of like ownership that I think is important. And besides that, you do your normal progressive income taxes. That's all fine and good. Also, basically, like it's funny. Going back to the means testing argument, taxing people too much is basically like not a real problem that happens. Except if like sometimes it's like people like write a law dumb and accidentally double tax people or something like that. But besides that, the main place it happens is in means testing. There are like there are times that, and you touched on this before, you can literally make more money and then lose money overall because of, means tested benefits being taken away. In the normal tax system, that doesn't actually happen, and it's not hard to make that not happen.
It's incredible how little people, or how little, let's say, right-wingers choose to understand marginal tax rates. I think that maybe that's what you're getting at, or maybe something else, but it's just like, if you raise taxes on millionaires, then they're going to be paying like 70% of their tax on everything. It's like, well, no, only on everything above $1 million. That is the entire point of marginal tax rates, right? So it's like, you can't like impoverish them through that mechanism if you have brackets. Right. Like you can't.
That is the thing too. You actually, if you poll people, which I don't even know what to do about this. If you poll people in the U.S., like massive, I forget the exact numbers, so I'm not going to quote them, but like a big chunk of the population is like, oh, I don't want to move into the next tax bracket because then I'll lose money. And it's like, no,
God.
It doesn't work that way. A lot of people think that. And yeah, very frustrating. Don't know what to do about that. But yeah. So and then on top of that, you basically you throw on basically whatever value added taxes you need to kind of as demand control for whatever other programs you're doing.
So would you be in favor of a kind of shifting sales tax then, right? Like that responded to inflation then? Is that what you were implying?
There is a thing too about, there's a thing that gets in the first place kind of misattributed to MMTers that, and to be fair, this is one of those things too of, you mentioned this about like the so-called neoliberals online, where like the actual like leaders and people tweeting or whatever are like fine, but then the kind of like, random people you find on Reddit or Twitter are like the worst. I think there's been a lot of confusion about MMT because there's like randos running around just saying stuff versus, what the actual kind of intellectuals are saying. And yeah, in that same, the Financial Times article I mentioned before, there's like a section there where they're like, no, like MMTers do not say you should increase taxes after inflation. They say that if you're trying to pass new spending, you should factor the taxes into that beforehand to cancel out any inflationary impact. And yeah, I don't think it's always a bad thing to like, raise or lower consumption taxes, especially a bit. But it's generally my view that taxes should be kept consistent, and it's the other stuff that should change. Just as a matter of like, people, you have a tax system and people know what it is and people know what the rates are, and then that's that. There are other ways to control demand that you can do stuff behind the scenes. And there's also like a weird thing of like, you will increase the price of goods a lot of times if you're, increasing the consumption tax on them. And that's like, well, okay, I guess technically demand went down, but like, what are we doing?
Yeah. That was one thing that I said when I first heard the raise taxes in response. I mean, you've got the automatic stabilizers as well, right? That's like a kind of, but you're not raising the rate or lowering the benefit amount in principle, right? You're just reducing the number of people that get benefits and increasing the number of people that pay taxes. So
Yeah.
that's like an MMT way of reducing demand. But yeah,
Yeah, and
automatically.
I don't know. It's funny. I kind of because I argued with the MMTers a lot during the. Oh my God, I don't know if you witnessed the job guarantee debates we used to have on Twitter. Literally like weeks long, hundreds of replies.
Yeah, yeah. I remember. I actually just watched a debate from a while ago between Matt Bruenig
Mhm.
and oh, I forget the name of the other guy about the job guarantee versus universal basic income. But I
What
remember
was
it
it?
was a massive thing.
Yeah, yeah. Ron Gray, maybe.
It wasn't Ryan Gray. It wasn't Ryan Gray. It was another guy I hadn't heard of.
I
Who's
might recognize it if I
yeah,
saw it.
yeah.
But yeah, so I was it's the funny thing is I was like kind of supportive of a job guarantee going into it, and then I read the proposals, then I'm like, no, I definitely don't support this. And on the opposite end, like I was always like this whole, MMTers have a whole thing about, how taxes don't finance spending and everything like that. And I was always really annoyed by it. I'm like, what are you doing? What is the point of making this argument? And then I read Nathan Tankis put out recently a paper, the title of the paper. Um,
I know which one
uh,
you're talking about.
yeah, monetary policy without interest rates. That's what it was called, I
That's
think.
it. Yeah.
And he basically laid out like, oh, here are all of like the some of it talking about other ways to finance spending, but also like, oh, here are kind of like a bunch of non-traditional ways that we can control demand if we want to. And I was just like, okay, this makes sense. Like you were right, I get it now. Um,
Mm.
and yeah, it's stuff like just to breeze over. It's stuff like a lot of the stuff in that proposal is basically kind of instead of messing around with the taxes or benefit rates or benefits stuff like that, it's about controlling credit creation.
Mm.
Controlling what kind of what sectors can banks loan to. How much in loans are they allowed to do? What quality of loans are they allowed to make? And that's stuff you can do behind the scenes to control to control demand and won't and to get back to the point of you don't want to bother people, right? You don't have to get people worrying about like what are the tax rates going to be changing now? There's inflation
Yeah,
and
yeah,
everything.
yeah. What's the tax rate tomorrow? Will I be able to
Right,
afford
right.
that?
Instead, you
Yeah,
can just like, we'll just do this stuff with the banks on the scene to kind
yeah.
of control better. And yeah, that's broadly my approach now. Is if you're doing a big chunk of new spending, get some taxes in there alongside it. And yes, if you're controlling, you know, uh, if there's just a period where demand gets higher than you want, you try to do more of this. You might get high for no particular. It's not like not necessarily that some new big spending thing has to pass for demand to get
Sure.
high. And so yeah, and if that happens, you do this stuff in kind of back end with the banks to control demand instead, and then don't have people worry about it as much.
Do you know Anne Pettifor? Have you seen her on Twitter? She's an economist in the UK.
Name's not ring a bell, but maybe if I saw it.
Yeah, she posts on a website called Prime Economics, and she's written a book, and she was one of the people that Dirk Bessemer paper credited with foreseeing the 2008 financial crisis.
Mm,
But she actually blamed, or at least attributed some of the 70s inflation to the deregulation in credit standards that occurred in the 70s in the UK, which I thought was really interesting because it dovetails quite nicely with that Tankers report that you were just talking about, where like credit creation got much more lax. And
right.
suddenly, I mean, we know, right, that means new money coming into the economy, right? That we know that money is created as credit.
Mhm.
And therefore, if you deregulate those standards, then you've got a kind of not, I wouldn't call it a standard monetarist story, but I suppose it can be made consistent with monetarism where you've got too much money chasing too few goods, right? And therefore
Yeah,
you
I
might
always
say that's inflation.
right. The funny thing I always mention is because people always want to they whatever right wingers try to complain about like the Fed printing money and stuff. Which yeah, I feel like most of the people who say printing money don't know what that even means. But the joke I always make is because if you look at your main money supply measures, it's basically all private bank created money.
Yeah.
So whenever people try to post those, I'm always like, the argument I always make, I'm like, private banks are being too greedy and they're driving inflation by creating a bunch of money. Uh, as with
Yeah.
all the best arguments, not technically wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just not the way people think about it. It's
Is
like,
it,
people want to pretend only the government can do that stuff.
Well,
But no.
it's like get government out of my welfare, right? Like we spoke
Yeah.
about earlier. It's like you are actually sincere, but you're also trolling, which is the best type. Where it's like a
Yeah.
credible troll that actually has evidence behind it, but also
Right. Same
it's
thing as
gonna
like
confuse
any
them.
good joke. Any good joke has a kernel of truth, right?
Yeah,
There
yeah,
is.
exactly. Yeah,
You're saying it in a funny way, but there is something real there.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and yeah, it's same thing about banks can create too much money sometimes.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. I think one other thing about funding it that I wanted to emphasize, and I think you did kind of touch on this implicitly, but it's like one argument you see quite a lot from like the left, and it's not really like the online left so much as it is like a populist argument. Is like we only need to raise taxes on the rich, which I think is really wrong. I mean, I know the Nordic model, shout out to them, have a nice little video on this where it's like, you can't do that. Again, do that. Raise taxes on the rich. It will raise some revenue. It will do a bunch of other good things, reducing inequality and all of the ills that come with that. But if you look at it from a pure revenue perspective, if you're trying to raise revenue with taxes, assume that's your goal. The rich, they actually, you need to broaden the tax base. You need to be taxing everybody, except the bottom maybe a bit more. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that and how you see that
that's
argument.
a lot of the Nordic people are some of my good friends on Twitter. Yes, very true. There's a good Matt Bruning article called something like the trilemma of welfare, something like that, where he talks about like basically if you want a big if you want a big welfare state, then you have to you do have to tax everybody for that. And
I haven't
yeah,
read
that's
that one.
definitely
I'll
true.
take a look at it. Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah, I don't remember it's one of those Bruning articles I
I've
keep
got
on.
it. The
Yeah,
trilemma of
yeah.
welfare, middle class taxes, and pre-distribution.
Yeah, and that's another part to bring into it is like you can get a whole lot of money from rich people if rich people get a whole bunch of money in the first place, but don't do that. Like don't
Yeah.
don't purposely set up a society that's giving a bunch of money to rich people in the first place. That's a bad idea.
Mm.
Um and yeah, if you want to bringing in the point earlier too about taking $1 in taxes from rich people is going to have a smaller effect on demand than taking it from, someone who's poorer. So it's like, on a one-to-one revenue to taxes basis, like, there's just not enough money to rich people to do these massive programs that we should do. And on the other hand, if you actually look at, the real resources involved and try to think of it in terms of demand offsets, it's even worse than that.
Yeah.
The demand offsets aren't the same. And yeah, it's one of those things. This is a problem in the U.S. especially. I don't know about how it goes in other countries, but just people just don't like taxes at all, and it's kind of anthemia to propose raising them on even like middle class people.
Mm.
Uh, and so people are like, oh well, we could just tax like 1% of people, and then it'll be fine. Um, and yeah, it's not that easy. Ultimately, that's too what kind of got me on Twitter with like Matt Bruning and stuff and with James Madlock, the whole tax positivity thing is like to get a fully developed, as we should have a fully developed, social democratic welfare system in the U.S. You're going to have to get people to think that taxes are okay.
Mm.
And yeah, as a hard thing to do. I personally would have I'm just trying to get at least convince liberals of that, right, in the U.S. And yeah, I found that normie liberals are pretty. It's funny. I think on Twitter maybe normie liberals get a bad rep, but yeah, if you approach like the average liberal, you can convince them of socialism fairly quickly. Usually, it's not that
Mm.
hard.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
No, yeah,
and-
you're right. You're absolutely right. Like my progressive friends, I think there's I mean, everyone's just fucking distracted by the culture wars at the moment. Like, it's just all about like, wokeism and cancel culture and whatever. But if you get past that and you start talking about like, welfare states and people are a lot of my sort of anti-woke friends are also very anti-Tory, right? Like they're not. It's not like they are right wingers in their entirety. So I kind of try to reorient them towards economic arguments, because I think you're right. Like the average centrist, even can actually, a person who thinks of themselves as a centrist can be convinced of these types of arguments for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and even if if you do polling in the U.S. of like, basically ask them, hey, do you think like workers should own most of companies? They'll be like, yeah. It's like, okay, what are we doing here?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is. I am much more of a pro-government ownership guy than and Americans are kind of more libertarian, but that can go in a left libertarian way just fine. And yeah, it doesn't take a lot of convincing. And yeah, in the U.S. too, I should say, because might have been over extrapolating a bit. The U.S. is so polarized at this point that the kind of like, I don't want to say everyone has the same views on all the issues. It's not exactly true. But the type of people, although electorally important, the kind of like more righty or maybe even more centrist people on social issues, and then like more left wing on economics. Yeah, electorally important group, but most people, when I'm talking about liberals, it's more the people who vote straight Democratic and are fairly progressive is more who I mean. And yeah, I mean it's like 40% of the country, and it's not that hard to convince them to be leftists. So that's what I've taken. A lot of like, that's kind of the audience I'm tweeting for a lot of the times. Is
it's kind of what my video was angled at in a way as well, right? Like, I mean, I had my finance friend message me and say he thought it was a good argument, and he's pretty money, but yeah, he sort of So I think it's like, I mean, it's just one example, but I don't know. I think people can be persuaded by socialism. I just think you don't call it that often, right? And I think there's this really weird asymmetry between leftists and rightists, because right, I mean, the way that alt-right got in was by vehemently denying that they were fascists, right? And like, I mean, obviously they are, but like there was this whole denial about, and if you look at someone like Jordan Peterson, like he won't even admit that he's a conservative, right? Like he they're just like, oh well, I'm a liberal, right? Or maybe a small L liberal, but a liberal, a free thinker or whatever. And like, there's this reluctance on the left to you have to be like, no, I'm a fucking Marxist, I'm a socialist, and like all this baggage. And you can be in your head, I don't mind, but I don't know. It's just like it's kind of this unwillingness to compromise even on a rhetorical level, even if you're not compromising actually on a substantial level. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, it is. It's baggage is the right word. It's a funny thing I think about too. Is it's also useful if I'm having a conversation, I don't know, with like friends or someone I just met around my age, who maybe isn't very politically involved. Like if I call myself a social democrat, they will have zero concept of what that means.
Yeah.
The U.S. does not have a social democratic party. They don't know what the hell I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But that is useful because there's no baggage. Then I can just explain to them, here's what I mean by that.
Sure.
And on the reverse, if I called myself a socialist, there's tons of baggage, especially in the U.S. that comes along with. And then the funny thing is, if you're in the online left, though, it's the opposite. If you're like, yeah, I'm a democratic socialist, everyone's like, okay, whatever. And then I get called a fascist for being a social democrat. And ultimately, it's one of those things. Yeah, that whatever ideological label you end up with, if it gets any level of popularity, is inevitably going to come with baggage.
That's true.
You see, even on my online circles, where it's like, oh, we start developing kind of, what we mean when we call ourselves social democrats. But then there's like, a group of people also on Twitter calling themselves social democrats who are much, much more right wing and like dumb about a lot of social issues, for example.
Yeah.
And that's like, oh, well, now we're associated with those guys. And that's just kind of inevitable, right? That you're always going to have, like you said, you're always going to have baggage. And yeah, so that's why I certainly don't lead with labels trying to talk with, with normal people.
Yeah. I don't either. Yeah, so I think I've kind of spoken to you about everything I wanted to. I don't know if you if you had it felt like we missed anything about social democracy that you wanted to get across.
Oh, let's see, covering the always worthwhile mention. This is I had one weird interaction that makes me always worthwhile to mention this. There's a buddy of mine who's an anarchist who I was talking to, who's a like a anarcho-syndicalist type, talking back and forth about and I was talking about blah blah about unions in Nordic countries and stuff like that. And he just didn't understand that and apparently this is a certain kind of anarchist approach too, is the the way social democrats want unions to be structured is as sectoral unions. So at the level of industries, not just at the level of companies, is how unions should be structured and run, basically. And yeah, there's lots of benefits to that. You don't get the thing of like whatever if McDonald's unionizes and Burger King doesn't, then it's just like, oh, okay, and then people dump money, capitalists dump money into Burger King instead, and then McDonald's goes out of business, and it's like, oh, okay, well that sucked. Um, and when you do it at an industry level, raise everybody's wages together. Uh,
Mm,
yeah, you prevent that if you do sectoral unions. And yeah, very very important part of the social democratic approach. Sweden took this to the extreme of they had their unions and then they had union federations. They had three big ones: one to represent blue collar workers, one for white collar workers, and one for public sector workers.
wow.
The blue collar and those confederations still exist, but they used to like just set wages. Like they had like massive macroeconomic control. The blue collar union especially led with that stuff. And yeah, you can get this great thing where, and this is very much social democratic approach is, you're always trying to get everyone together, right, into one bucket, everyone into unions, into union confederations, everyone onto the same welfare and tax plans and everything
Mm,
like that. Universal coverage, not doing coverage, universal healthcare coverage, not doing by employer, everything. You want everyone to be together to, just as a pro solidarity thing. And yeah, it was very much this approach. And there's a recent New York Times article, a union leader talked about this, where they said, we won't protect jobs, but we will protect workers. It was
mm,
their approach that, like, we are just going to keep ratcheting up, wages, especially at the lower end, ratcheting up the wages, not just minimum wages, but, across the pay board, how much you have to, across the pay scale, how much you have to pay people. And some businesses won't be able to take it and will go out of business. And then we
mm,
are going to take those people and reemploy them other places and they will make more money. And we are going to keep on doing that. And again, this is the pro investment way of doing things too. You want companies to panic and have to invest a lot, and to developing better, and it just it weeds out the shitty, unproductive companies faster. And yeah, this is like
mm,
that's a very core important part of the social democratic approaches. Getting everyone together increases their wages across the scale, and basically
mm.
forcing unproductive companies out of business, and then having programs, having active labor market policy and stuff to retrain people and get them back into new jobs.
It's
And that
so anarcho-syndicalist as well. It has to be said, right? Isn't it? Like it shows so well. I think like the point that we've been trying to make, which is that like they're not necessarily opposed, right?
right. Yeah, and that's yeah. One more thing to mention. Uh, and yes, person in the chat. Yes, I'm Keegs, plural, not singular. Uh, it's a shortening of my last name.
Keeg or something.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, this is one other point I want to make. There's an excellent. I don't know if you follow. There's an excellent YouTuber does like history of anarchism stuff. Anarcho is her name.
Yeah,
Zoe
Zoe.
Baker. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, she's great. I followed her, been a patron of hers for a while now. And she talks about one of the things, which it seems like this is like novel, me talking about it this way. I haven't seen other people say it, but there's this whole anarchist thing, which I'm sure you've read about. The critique of means and ends. And kind of the whole anarchist thing for a while was like, okay, if you want to end up in a stateless society, you can't like build a state to do that, right? There's a
Mm,
conflict between the means and the ends. If you make people are shaped by social forces. If you
sure.
make the kind of people that are used to, being in a state or controlling people, or even just electing people into the state, that's not naturally going to become stateless. You have to start with stateless things, and then that will naturally develop into a statelessness. That was always kind of the core critique of, Marxist or maybe Leninist approaches. And but yeah, I think the exact same idea applies to social democracy. Of course, we're not, social democrats are trying to get to a stateless state. But a lot of what and this is Rudolf Meissner, the famous Swedish economist, talks about this too. Is a lot of what is the plans he had and stuff like that was about like, okay, you can't just jump people into being able to self-govern themselves in the economy, right? They need to learn how to do this. And the same thing with when people got political democracy, right? It wasn't just like they immediately knew how to participate as political citizens. They had to develop that, live in the culture, right? Develop as political citizens. And with social democracy, it's the same thing. It's the idea of increasing union power isn't just a good in and of itself. It teaches people how to democratically run the economy. And it's the same thing of starting up. This is another kind of forgotten part of the social democratic stuff of starting up like consumer cooperatives and stuff like that, especially housing co-ops and all that. And that was part of like we need to start building out these structures so people could start learning how to govern themselves and how to do socialism basically. And yeah, if you teach them how to do that, it's only natural that we'll develop more, into more economic democracy. And yeah, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think people give reformism a bad name as if it can't include, it can't include like building up whatever, like the cooperative sector or something like that, right? It's not, reformism doesn't just mean some technocratic changes of stuff. It can also mean setting up the right structures so people learn how to govern themselves.
Well, there's this idea of non-reformist reforms, right? Have you ever heard of that? But that's like, reforms that build the grounds for something more. So the union policy that you just outlined in Sweden would be a very good example of that.
That is a messy term, but
it's a horrible term. It's a horrible term.
Yeah. But yes, that is the basic idea of what I'm getting at, right? Not just reforms of like, oh, we changed this thing and we're done now, but setting up structures that are self-sustaining. And that get people to reach for and to do more. And yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad you said that actually, because I didn't really ask about the labor movement and those union sectors. I mean, sectoral unions. Sorry, not union sectors. Protecting all workers, bargaining at the sector level. Not leaving any behind, not allowing for competition between different businesses, and between different unions. Actually, really, in the end, if you've got unions on a firm by firm basis, then then you have you can get competition, and that's not what you want. You want solidarity, obviously the opposite. So yeah, building up those and also having them as a way of managing inflation as well. I think that's really. Another bonus, like having those, which again, Scandinavian countries, Northern European countries, actually not just North, a lot of European countries have something like this. It's weird that we don't know that in the Anglo world as much as we should do. That a lot of the inflation management in Europe does bring workers to the table in order to negotiate how wages are going to increase, in order to, treat them fairly while preventing a wage price spiral, which is a thing that can happen. And it's a really common policy. And it varies across, the countries. It's more centralized or whatever, but it's a real thing. And we don't pay enough attention to it at all. We just think of central banks as the custodians of inflation.
Oh God, nightmare. Yeah. It's one of those, it's interesting thinking of like the ways that certain policies have like Nordic countries especially, but plenty of European countries, and I think this is especially bad in the U.S. that like just the realm of what people think is possible is so small, and not just as a matter of imagination, as a matter of like knowing what things are already done in other countries, and that's a hard thing to overcome people too, of just being able to like, no, this policy already happens and we can also do it if we want to. Like it doesn't, I know it might sound crazy or something like that, but yeah, that things are totally doable. Unions being an important part of macroeconomic management. I know also like Sweden, especially being a kind of smaller policy, they're part of talking about export policy and stuff like that. That
Sure.
was again something unions were very involved with because, of course, you're increasing wages in the manufacturing sector. It's going to affect your exports and stuff like that. Um, and yeah, I think that's this is in your work in democracy video, you use this phrasing too. Yeah, it really is. It's about bringing workers to the table, right? Yeah, it is a good thing. At least giving them some kind of voice. Yeah, to pretend like we just have to, increase interest rates and then crush their wages, and we don't like it's bad to ask them what the right way to go about that is very
Mm.
silly.
Yeah.
Uh, um,
Absolutely.
yeah, is there anything else I wanted to mention? Welfare stuff, blah blah blah. Yeah, there's an interesting point I always like to make of yeah about the social democratic policy is what it's really doing is, and it's a whole other thing to get into talking about like soft budget constraints.
Mm.
Um, this idea about how like the Soviet Union, for example, like businesses didn't or businesses firms and stuff didn't really fail. The government just kind of pumped more money into them whenever like they got low on money, and this was bad for many reasons. In an interesting way, this was mentioned briefly in a paper, but I don't remember where. But like the fact that a particular employer can be particularly exploitative and pay people way less than they would make elsewhere, um, is a kind of soft budget constraints. Initially, we're talking about capital markets. Usually capital markets impose discipline on firms, so they
Yeah.
can't just get forever, right? Um, but on the labor side of things, like if a firm is working really poorly, they can just underpay people a whole bunch, and then the firm continues existing, even though it's really unproductive and shitty. And that's just it's a different way of it's the same core problem of these inefficient firms continuing to exist because they can mess around with stuff like that, and that's what a lot of one way to think about too about these kind of sector-wide policies and stuff like that is saying like, no, here's what you're paying people, and then you're gonna survive if you can be productive enough, right? You can't mess
Mm.
around and just
Yeah.
choose to like, I'll just pay people less and exploit more and continue existing. Like, no, if you can't keep up, we're forcing you out.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
and
funny, isn't it? Because that nobody says, oh well, if a business can't pay rent or can't afford its inputs, or gets divested from because because shareholders revolt or whatever, I don't know. Everyone kind of accepts that. They're like, oh well, then it wasn't a good enough business and it should go bust. But then it's like, well, what we're talking about is adding, okay, if you can't pay your workers enough, who, by the way, are more important than landlords or shareholders,
yes,
or
obviously.
more in need, then you should also go bust, right? That's just it's still, I mean, it's still like a version of capitalism, really, in a way. But it's just weird that people don't accept that ethic when it comes to labor costs. It's like, no, they should be able to pay as little as they
Yeah,
want, and we've internalized that.
yeah, and it's especially I do get frustrated about this. This shows some leftist discourse a lot because at least in the U.S., small businesses get a lot of special benefits, um,
Mm.
and small business creation. The creation part I think is important, but beyond that, it's like no, you don't get to pay people less just because you're small.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and yeah, that's frustrating. Something frustrating I come up with a lot. I did something in chat I think worthwhile exertion. I saw the
yeah.
talking about someone mentioned something like about how like if you really challenge capitalism, capitalism will bring out the guns thing. Um, yeah, this idea that if you really try to start advancing socialism, they're gonna whatever start some more or something like that. I think that's applicable probably in many more developing countries. In the West, I think it's pretty outdated. That's not really how these things go down. Um, if you actually look at like what has stopped, powerful leftist movements in the West, it's uh, voters kicked them out at some point. It might have been for stupid reasons, but that's what ends up happening. I think more than that is the issue of media control is the bigger issue, right?
I was
The
about to
way,
say that actually. Yeah,
yeah, the way that capitalists can fight back, it's like the state has the guns now. They don't really, it's no longer just a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. They can't just rich people can't just tell the government what to do. But what they do is control the media, and people obviously get their views of how the world is going through the media. And yeah, that's how that backlash can happen. I think is spreading stuff through the media. Many examples of this in Sweden at the time.
Mm.
The whole what's her face? Pippi Longstockings or something like that. This whole thing complaining about how like it's one of those weird things where it was like a really big media thing at the time where like, oh, like this some like popular children's book author was like, oh, their tax rate was over 100% or something like that, and it's like, oh, like they're taxing people too much. There's two things about that. One, I've never found any evidence it's actually true, and two, if it was just like this like niche thing about like might have been some law written poorly about like that basically accidentally double taxed like self-employment income, but people acted as if it was like some like, oh, like some giant failure of how the tax system was working in Sweden. And yeah, I think even little things like that, if the the media can spread that stuff around, or it doesn't even need to. You talked about culture war stuff. Okay, even if the left has a perfect handle on the economic stuff, just in the U.S., you just get them mad at immigrants, and then they'll kick all the left wing people out. It's just unfortunately that works.
Yeah. The PragerU for kids as well. That you just reminded me of PragerU for kids.
Yeah, I've been watching a YouTuber Big Joel has been making some videos about that.
Yeah.
Oh my, it's so bad.
It's astonishing. I'd recommend not watching PragerU for kids, everyone, but watch Big Joel's videos on them because it's unbelievable. Sort of a Columbus apologia or. I don't know anything you can think of that they would possibly do, but with like a kid's cartoon, and it's just oh my God.
And that's the stuff. Yeah, the media stuff I think is what's really hard at the end of the day, because also it's like what like us leftists are gonna start the next CNN. Like we don't have the money. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Like,
no, yeah, it is. Yeah, it's resources, right? And it's like these. How did Ben Shapiro get famous? Well, because he was massively boosted in the YouTube algorithm, had huge production. I mean, who goes and does a fucking talk at like I've done talks at universities, right? I don't think anybody was filming me, and if they were, it wouldn't have been from 5 different angles with £2,000 cameras. Like and like a proper like it was all just orchestrated, and then he got really famous. Like there's loads of fucking money behind it, and so that influence over the discourse, it always makes me laugh with them. I don't want to rant about it too much, but like Stephen Crowder, did you remember with Stephen Crowder's his dispute with the Daily Wire came out, and it was like they were only offering him like 20 million or something like that. It's like I can't the amount of resources at their disposal, the media, and that's not even the institutional media. I dread to think what fucking Murdoch has in the locker, right? It's just it's truly astounding. So that, I mean, fighting that, I agree with you. It's more important than more important. It's more significant than the state has the guns type argument that you were talking about.
Yeah, and the other thing to mention too is I think, and this was I think this definitely hurt Sweden at the time too, was basically letting inflation get high. The left did not have a good way to address and cool down inflation. And people hate inflation. It doesn't, even if people's wages kept up, they would still hate inflation, right? And there's going to be a political backlash against that. And yeah, so that's another thing which I think we've gotten. I talked about some of the more MMT demand management stuff, especially now. It's leaching more into kind of even mainstream economic circles about like keeping an eye on maintaining supply chains and all that.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I'm hopeful about, is we've developed a our ways of approaching and analyzing that is not sophisticated enough, but more sophisticated now.
Yeah.
And so I'm more hopeful we'll be able to address that stuff. And I think it's also helpful of there's kind of two trends here. One is there's a kind of broad social liberalization going on. There's various backlashes against that, but especially in the I can't speak to polling everywhere, of course, but like in the U.S., young people are just very socially liberal. Even people who identify as people who are younger, who are young and who are Republicans even, are often fairly socially liberal, at least not as insane as the older Republicans are. And yeah, that's going to blunt the you want to try to freak out people about immigration, but most of them are fine with immigrants, at a certain point, then it's just not going to work as well anymore. And yeah, so that makes me hopeful. Yeah, that's not true in every country. I know it's specifically, younger people being more liberal, more progressive, whatever, as a normal trend. But I know in Israel specifically, actually, younger people are much more conservative. Nightmare. What do you do? I don't know. But yeah, that also makes me hopeful, kind of for the future of the left in America.
Yeah.
That anti-immigrant, anti-trans stuff is just going to have less of a bite as time goes on.
Oh, but the anti-trans stuff. I mean, it's not hitting. I mean, I can't remember who. Maybe Vorsh made a video about it, but it was like it didn't work right in the midterms. It's like the Republicans have gone all in on this fucking anti-trans stuff. And it's like, yeah, okay, there's a significant minority of people who just like hate all trans ideology, as they call it. But like, it's just like people, I think, like, they're just often indifferent. I think a lot of people have that kind of live and let live kind of liberal. They're like, they don't know anything about trans issues. They're probably not going to be that helpful, but they just don't really care enough to like vote for Republicans for like to ban transgender women from swimming or whatever the Republicans want to put in. Like what people have. One good thing about liberalism is like that kind of people, what people want to do in the privacy of their own homes with their own bodies, blah, blah, blah. That is really none of my business. And it does give me hope, because I think in the UK right are going all in on it now. And I don't think people, I mean, I'm on Turf Island, right? So I think it's worse here than it is in the States, to be honest with you, in terms of the general population. But I don't think it's a winning electoral strategy, that kind of stuff. So they might have overplayed their hand with the conservative propaganda.
Yeah, all that stuff you mentioned about the kind of more liberal approach. Yeah, very much. It might even be more true in the U.S. that people are like that. That they're just like, I don't really care. Shut up about it. Like,
yeah.
And this is a point. David Shore, an election poller analyst I follow, I really like. He makes this point a lot too about how, and this is, I don't, when I'm talking about this too, this is U.S. data and stuff like that I've studied, but I think it's internationally true as well. That like, even if you could poll people, right? If you like poll people and ask like, whatever, like, should trans women be banned from like women's sports or something like that, you might get a majority of people agreeing with you. But that doesn't mean if you actually try to do it, most people will agree with it. Now that sounds strange, but the reason that happens is because people don't. It's going to be Republicans pushing that stuff, and people don't trust, the right. Excuse me, in other countries, but people don't trust the right to be like doing something smart about like about trans issues, right? Yeah. Even if they might agree with it in principle, they're like, I don't really. These guys are like imposing, and like they're always trying to do this crap, and like I don't really like it. This reflects this is obviously more of a U.S. thing, but guns is a big issue of like, you can actually look at, if you do polling about like, whatever, I don't know, maybe universal background checks or something like that. You'll do polling on it in the U.S. And then you do a referendum on it, and the referendum does like 15 points worse, because it becomes a thing of like, well, I like this in the abstract, but these Democrats are always trying to take our guns. And it's kind of irrational. But it's helpful in areas like this, and abortion too is the same thing. Republicans way overextended on that. People do not like the Republican position on abortion, and they trust Democrats with it way more. It's the same thing of like, if you poll things in some states, like the abortion laws would be more liberal than it looks like the population would support, but it's because they don't trust the Republicans to put any kind of restriction on this stuff, And yeah, so I think that's why trans issues doesn't have the same juice, I don't think, as like immigration does.
It is worth saying. I think a couple of people in chat are pointing out like one big issue. I mean, we have it across both sides of the Atlantic, but it's like the people don't support these things, but because the Republicans are favored by the Electoral College and have power over the Supreme Court and gerrymander, right? They are able to enact their will even despite their lack of support.
Yeah, that's a big issue on the national level, but a lot of times, a lot of the really draconian like anti-trans stuff right now is happening at the state level, and I'm sorry, there's just a lot of those people suck. You know what I mean? Like there's just a lot of bad people that
in
are
Florida.
yeah, in
The
Florida.
most bad people are in Florida. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the most in the world, I think. And yeah, that's a definitely federally that stuff is an issue, but yeah, like the state level, it's a kind of funny thing too, because naturally there's like in Florida you could just do all this insane stuff and get away with it, right? But it reflects badly on the Republicans nationally. That we can just be like, look at what these like freaks are doing down here of like, sending dragging kids away from their parents just because they're trans or whatever, and yeah, that freaks people out in the rest of the country. But yes, I mean that's another. God, it's a whole thing of talk about hard barriers to get through in the U.S. It's just we are constitutionally undemocratic. What do you do? Like,
yeah.
That really
That's
sucks.
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question either. Yeah.
There's some stuff you can do to limit the Supreme Court, but when it comes to like the Senate and Electoral College,
Yeah.
So-
I don't know. It's a deep problem with a lot of history, isn't it? But you can also do good things at the state level as well, right?
absolutely.
That's the benefit.
Yeah. New York State is very. Where I live in New York State. New York State has a lot of good. Our abortion law is quite good. We've passed. Our laws are even like much more liberal than Roe v. Wade was. That we have passed into law abortion protections now. So yeah, that stuff. There are two ends to that stuff, of course.
Yeah, I mean the US is fucking massive. Like it really is. I know that's not a particularly deep insight or very well put, but it's like it's really big and diverse, and like there's the management of it as a single country. I think I don't want to descend into apologetics for all of the things that are wrong in the US and have been, but I'm just saying managing that size of country politically, and in the way it's structured as a federation of states, you can think of it as more equivalent to like Europe than like the UK in terms of like how many people are being impacted by a policy in a state. We know that California is like the 7th largest economy in the world or something, and it's massive in terms of population. I don't know what the number is, but it's like so many millions of people are affected by what happens in California, that you have to think about it maybe a little bit differently, than just thinking everything's going wrong in the USA. Right.
Yeah, it is funny. You mentioned earlier about, I forget, some about a 2-hour train ride from London to somewhere. I forget.
To Manchester, yeah.
Yeah, and I just started talking about how little and tiny the UK is compared to the size of the United States. It's about a 5-hour train ride for me to get from where I am to DC, which is like halfway down the country. Yeah, massive place. And the kind of the federal kind of state level split up of powers complicates a lot of that. Complicates a lot of that kind of stuff. But yeah, someone mentioned too. I did want to. Probably when I mentioned trans stuff, they mentioned Magnus Hirschfeld, who was he was like a pioneer. One of my best friends actually was just writing a research paper on him. A pioneer in basically like studying trans people in Germany in like the early 1900s. Of course, one of those people that the Nazis burned all of his stuff. But yeah, that's a good example. Whenever people try to say, trans people were made up 20 years ago or something like that, he was studying them back then. There's some quote, he developed this whole topology for like, which ended up in him saying, I forget, he said there's like 7 million genders or something like that. It ruled. He had a whole topology developed of like,
he
all
had
these
like
different...
a specific number in mind.
Yes,
that was very high, right?
All the traits you can have and like multiply out how many combinations there are.
Oh, so it's kind of like a factorial design. Right,
Yeah, exactly.
It's like along this dimension you're this, and along this and then I've done the maths. Yeah.
It's so brilliant. That's a funny little fact about him. But yeah, also very interesting historical research, and what event has survived is very useful. But yeah.
Yeah. I have one final question for you, which doesn't pertain to anything we've spoken about. Did you once say that you do a number of mathematical integrals every day for fun?
Yes.
Do you still do that?
Yeah, I wouldn't, not necessarily every day, but
Right.
there's channels I follow that do, yeah, do especially calculus I like, differential equations and stuff like that I do, and yeah, I still do that fairly lately. I really like math.
Right. Okay. Wow. Yeah. I wish I liked it that much.
Hey, buddy, you're the economist. What are you coming at me for? Like,
I don't like maths. I'm good at it. There's actually two very
ah,
different things. People always say it to me
sure.
like, "Oh, you like maths, don't you?" And I'm like, "Well, no, actually, I just like can do it. So therefore, people think that I like it, and they like
Right.
used to get me like maths books and stuff. And I was like, "Can you just
You're
like
like,
get me
no, I
a
don't.
computer game
No, yes, I
or like
do.
a bike?"
Yeah, I very much enjoy doing that. That is something. One thing I want to mention too, relevant to your channel, is
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I try not to. I think I got lucky, and like the type of math that is done in economics specifically is often not that interesting to me. I like stuff that's
I was
like,
rubbish.
yeah, I like stuff that's like, here's a cool, like, here's this insane looking integral, and it actually ends up in something really simple and unexpected.
Mm.
Right? Great. But yeah, the kind of math in economics is not like that, so I didn't like it.
Well, economics is kind of like here's this really simple topic, and the maths ends up actually being really insane and convoluted, which is like the opposite way around. Like for me, the
Right,
beauty of maths is when you can make something simple out of something very complex.
right,
Yeah, like
exactly.
you said. Whereas it's the opposite in in economics. It's like how can we use like a massive dynamic optimization problem to say raising interest rates is going to reduce inflation. It's just like you go through pages of maths and it's like it's ugly. It's not beautiful,
Yeah,
which
and
is
that's the
yeah.
I mention it because I think that some people studying economics can fall into like, they like that kind of math, and they're like, "Ooh, this is cool, so it's right."
Mm,
And yeah, I can, I, even if I don't like that kind of math, I can kind of understand that pull, right?
yeah.
And yeah, it's something I try very carefully. I think it's important to know. A careful thing to avoid is, and also not that, this is something I think I've thought more and more over time. Like, you don't have to mathematize everything to know how the economy, to know things about the economy, right?
No.
If you just,
Mathematize observables is my rule.
yes, exactly, exactly.
Or mostly observables. Not everything can be, but
Yeah,
mostly stay grounded.
there's an excellent, it's an excellent article by Alex Williams, who's like my favorite economist. I don't know if you'd find himself that way. About something like the five principles of post Keynesian economics, and that's one of them is quantify the quantifiable.
Yeah.
Is, yeah, stuff can get so messy if you try to go beyond that, and it's like you can make this whole model and stuff, right, of the economy, but if you just like know a bunch of facts, like qualitative facts about supply chains or something like that, that's going to give you way better insight than if
Oh,
you spent years developing a model about stuff.
100%.
And so, yeah, that's a careful, as much as I love math, you can't fall into too much, relying on math
Mm.
for everything.
And you miss stuff, I think, with maths. Like supply chains are a good
Yeah,
example of something that economists don't really talk about, which is really
right.
weird. Um,
Yeah, even though you could
I don't know why.
talk to a random business owner, and they'll know all about
Oh,
it. But
it's yeah, absolutely, and or a journalist. A lot of economic journalists will know about it, but like the amount of stuff, because I've been looking into supply chains recently, the amount of stuff on supply chains in mainstream economics journals is like people have a go at economists for not looking at finance before the financial crisis.
right,
And
same.
they also have a go at them for not looking at the distributional effects of trade. Um, Both of those pale in comparison to the lack of knowledge of supply chains. I couldn't believe how little there was. Honestly, it's astounding. You have to rely on business, like business textbooks and stuff like that, or journalism. Um,
Yeah, and it's the same thing. And not to go on a whole thing about this because I've been blabbing on for a while, but it's the same thing I always mention on on Twitter about. It's one of the things that got me into heterodox economics too, is about price setting. Um,
hmm,
where I got a certain point into studying mainstream economics, and I'm like, wait, they haven't actually shown people are setting prices this way. Like,
yeah.
wait, what are we doing here? Like, wait, did they go around and ask people? Are they actually like doing research on what's going on, or did they just kind of say stuff? And yeah, unfortunately, it's unfortunate because they're business leaders and they're capitalists, and we don't always trust them. But that's like you have to rely on them a lot of the times because they're the only ones talking about like, oh, here's actually how we going about setting prices. How's the supply chain going, stuff like that.
Mm.
And yeah, economists need to develop all that stuff more. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously, yeah, obviously, I completely agree with you. um, yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think I've got to cook my dinner. But yeah, thanks for coming on. It was really nice to speak to you.
Good to talk
Yeah.
to you.
And yeah, I guess I'll see you and everybody else later. Thanks. This was quite a long stream in the end. I think it was, yeah, it's almost 4 hours. So thanks very much, everyone, and I'll see you all later.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
See ya.
See y'all around.